Hey everybody, welcome to Storyline. Thank you so much for tuning in as we continue our Think Different series. Steve Jobs was a rare combination of designer and engineer. And it was this fusion of aesthetic sense with a sense for what's going on under the hood of computer technology that made him such a brilliant innovator in his field. He described what was going on in his thinking when he said, design is not just what it looks like and feels like. Design is how it works. He's referring, of course, to Apple products, but he's talking about the world in general. And he's essentially saying that design isn't merely aesthetics. It's not just a veneer. It has to do with what's under the hood, what's going on beneath the surface. And in this, Jobs was unique because he was looking at the world around him and observing the way reality operates and then incorporating those features into his design. On another occasion, explaining the creative process, he said that creativity is just connecting things. Just connecting things, he said. That is to say that Steve Jobs was an observer of what's going on around him in the natural world and then took those features and incorporated them into the products that he was creating. He goes on and says, when you ask creative people how they did something, they feel a little guilty because they didn't really do it. They didn't really do it. They just saw something. It seemed obvious to them after a while. They just saw something. They connected things. They were moving through life, observing the way things operate, and suddenly the epiphany comes and the design emerges out of observation. Now, I'd like to explore with you, in part 3 of our Think Different series, the way reality itself is designed to operate by God Himself. We're titling this session Law and Sin, and I know, of course, that that is a rather mundane and boring title, but you'll see that it's not really mundane or boring at all. We're essentially going to ask 2 questions that are related. Number 1, how is reality designed? And number 2, how does reality work? What's actually going on as we observe the things taking place in the world and in the universe around us? Now, let's begin by exploring how Scripture describes the law of God. And this is fascinating because you'll notice, first of all, in Psalm 119, verse 32, that David, King David, under inspiration, perceives the law of God as a vast horizon of freedom. Watch this. He says, I run in the path of your commands, for you have set my heart free. Notice the relationship in this passage between law, or God's commands, and freedom. We don't naturally think of these two things going together, but if you incorporate, as David does here, the idea of running within God's commands, you immediately realize that there's something brilliant being described here. If you try to break into a sprint, for example, in a room that is 10 feet by 10 feet, you're not going to get up much speed before you run into the wall. In order to run, you necessarily have to have a large horizon, a large platform of freedom. Running requires an expansive horizon. David perceives God's law like that. God's law is actually the opposite of restrictive. It is liberating. James chapter 1 and verse 25 picks up on this concept, and James says that God's law is a perfect or complete law of liberty. Notice the juxtaposition of 2 words that we don't normally bring together in a single sentence: law and liberty. Law conjures up in our minds the idea of restriction. Liberty, of course, conjures up in our minds the idea of freedom. But what do these two things have to do with one another? How can a law be liberating? How can a restriction actually produce greater mobility and freedom and expansion? Well, think about it like this. Within the parameters of Scripture, we have this idea of the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments, well, it's a short list, but that short list of 10 commandments is further reducible, according to Scripture, to just 2 commandments. And the 2 commandments that are articulated in Scripture are reducible to 1 commandment. On all levels, you're looking at the same thing, but at different configurations, if you will. For example, in Matthew 22, Jesus was asked a question by somebody. Teacher, this particular individual asked, which is the great commandment in the law? So the question here is regarding the law of God. And Jesus said to him in verse 37, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. Jesus identified this as the first great commandment. And he said that the second is like it. Like it in what sense? Well, he says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And then Jesus makes this remarkably simple and yet profound statement. He says in verse 40, on these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Are you tracking with what Jesus is saying here? Are you letting it really register and come into your thinking in such a way that you can understand that Jesus is essentially saying that the entire Old Testament scriptures, which he calls the law and the prophets, the writings of Moses, and then all of the other prophets after Moses, that all of Scripture is reducible to 2 commandments according to Jesus. 2 commandments. Love God, love your fellow human beings. And of course, there is a single principle that is in play in these 2 commands, and that principle is love, which Scripture defines as other-centered relational dynamics. Now, it's fascinating because Scripture then, building on that premise in 1 John chapter 3, verse 4, says that sin is transgression of the law. Now, again, what is the law? Well, the law is love. Not only does Jesus teach this, but Paul in Galatians chapter 5 says all the law is fulfilled in one word, even in this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And Paul, again, in Romans chapter 13, verse 10 says, love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. Are you tracking with what Scripture is saying here? When we say that sin is transgression of the law, we're simply understanding that sin, by definition, is any pattern of thought or feeling or behavior that goes against the grain of the fundamental law of the universe, and that is the law of love. Sin is all anti-love actions, behaviors, relational dynamics, even thoughts and motives and feelings. Everything that moves contrary to love is what the Bible defines as sin. God's law, therefore, is inherent to the design of life itself. It's not externally imposed upon life. The law, the single law, the one law of God is love. Now, the ancient Israelites, they understood the law of God to entail 613 commandments that they could map out from the writings of the Old Testament. 613 laws. But really, all of that, the entire Old Testament, is reducible to one single law, one single principle, one single relational dynamic. And that relational dynamic is love. Think about it like this. God's law works in a certain manner. God's law, at first consideration, from our point of reference as fallen human beings who are ourselves already restricted and we are completely confused as with regards to the way things work, at first glance, God's law looks like it's restrictive. But as we move into the actual realm of God's law and begin to operate by its principles, we begin to relate to people, to others, to God, even to ourselves, we find that our horizon expands. We begin to have a larger and larger sense of mobility and freedom and liberty. God's law is liberating as we go deeper and deeper under the hood, so to speak, to understand its design. Sin, by contrast, works in exactly the opposite manner. At first consideration, sin may look like it's liberating, like it offers to us a great deal of freedom. But the deeper into sin we go, the more restrictive it becomes. The parameters of our relationships and our psychology and our emotionality, everything about our lives begins to narrow and restrict under the influence of sin. So sin at first consideration, looks like freedom and gradually leads to greater and greater restriction, whereas God's law at first consideration looks often to us like it's restrictive and yet gradually leads to greater and greater freedom. It's counterintuitive because of our condition as fallen human beings. We desperately need to, by faith, move in the direction of the law of God, which is to say, in the direction of the principle of other-centered love, and we will find at first that it is challenging, it is difficult, it seems to impose upon us limitations, but we gradually become more and more free. C.S. Lewis, describing Satan's MO, describes the devil as working on a particular premise. He describes sin as an ever-increasing craving for an ever-diminishing pleasure. This is the devil's formula, he says, to get a man's soul and give him nothing in return. Wow, this is just a brilliant understanding of what's really going on when we move in our way of living contrary to the grain of reality. You can't grab hold of the fabric of reality and twist it out of shape for too long before it wants to bounce back and maybe even cause pain in the process of taking its original form. God made the world to operate in a very specific way. In Psalm 19, verses 7 and 8, we read this brilliant insight. The law of the Lord is perfect. That is, the law of the Lord is complete, converting or restoring the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. The statutes of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commands of the Lord, the command of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes. Think about it. According to this scripture, God's law increases or restores mobility to the human mind and heart and life. It makes us more free, not more restricted. God's law, according to this passage, imparts wisdom. That is to say, God's law describes the way life is, the way life operates. And the more we understand God's law, the more we understand the way things operate. But he goes on in this passage and says that God's law rejoices the heart. It generates joy. It produces happiness. And then he says it enlightens the eyes. It opens the mind. God's law is the means by which we become more and more and more liberated in our existence, not more and more restricted. Steve Jobs understood that the real essence of good design and engineering is simplicity. Simple, he said, can be harder than complex. Simple can be harder than complex. What does he mean by this? You have to work hard to get your thinking clean of all the clutter of the additions and all of the accumulation of unnecessary features. You have to work hard to get your mind clean, to make it simple. But it's worth it in the end, because once you get there, once you reduce things to their simplest form, then he says you can move mountains. Now, of course, he's talking about design, product and service design, but this is true regarding life in general. We need to reduce things to their simplest possible form. And once we understand the simple form, then we can build on that. God, I'm going to suggest to you, is the original minimalist, because everything God has made is built on a single design feature, and that single design feature is love. The best way to think different is to think in harmony with the way things are. Design is not so much a matter of twisting and shaping reality to fit our ideas. According to Steve Jobs, good design is merely a process of observation, noticing the way things are and then interfacing with the way things are. Design in God's universe is one simple, profound law, one simple principle, and that simple principle is love. Once we understand this, we are thinking clearly for the first time in our lives. Once we understand this, we begin to grasp the fact that everything in life, every relationship, every pursuit, it doesn't matter what it is best understood as the outworking of a single design principle. And that single design principle is other-centeredness, service, putting others first and foremost and taking a back seat to the needs of others, which then in turn remarkably expands our emotions, our minds, our lives, and we become more and more free as we comprehend and apply the law of love to every aspect of our lives. Think different. Think love as the one law of life.